Morning, everybody. Thanks for being here today. I want to introduce Bill Cadwell, who is our clerk of session from 700 miles away. Is it
400.
400? Okay.
400.
It seems so.
My voice wouldn't carry 700 miles.
Yeah. So we're talking about a particular book that I think is one of the more important books that has been written in recent years. Especially if you're interested in the issue of poverty in America, because America creates poverty in a very specific way with very specific ends. And as a Matthew 25 congregation, we have promised to do what we can to eliminate systemic poverty in America, which is a huge task. But the good thing about this book is that it suggests steps by which we can become poverty abolitionists. I don't know if, Bill, you're going to get that far today.
Probably not.
Okay, but if not, we're going to be discussing this.
Well, I knew you were going to speak again, and I sort of left that part for you.
That's what I thought. We're going to be speaking about this book again. What was the date that we decided on that?
The 18th of May.
May 18th. And so if possible, I would strongly recommend that everybody read Poverty by America. You'll want to have read it, even if you're not taking part in the discussion. It's very short. It's very well written, easy to read. It's one of those books that has as much footnote content as text content. And if you skip the footnotes, you'll have it done in a few hours.
But also Bill has some.
And Bill has a nice synopsis of the book that if you don't have the time to read the book, you could just read Bill's synopsis. It does not include the steps, I don't believe.
No.
Okay. And the steps, I think some of them will be becoming moot with the changes to federal spending right now, but a lot of them are still very relevant. So the book is Poverty by America by Matthew Desmond, and you'll be glad you read it. So please do.
He also wrote the very important book Evicted.
Yes.
For which he won a Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's about the housing crisis in America.
Yes.
So this guy's very interested in poverty in America, and he's got some good answers and some good thoughts. You can find the book online for very cheap, get a used copy, and donate it to the flea market when you're done. So
okay.
All right. So let's pray, and then we'll give it to Bill. I know, Bill, you need to have the rest of the hour. So let's pray. God of life, we give you thanks for the many blessings of our lives. We give you thanks for just the space and the leisure to talk about poverty as if it weren't something that we were struggling with ourselves. We ask, oh God, that you would be present in our conversation and help it to bear fruit in the lives of people who are struggling with poverty. Help us to be a blessing to them. Through Christ we pray. Amen.
First, a word about the title. When you say the title, Poverty by America, it makes no sense at all. It sounds like America wrote a book named Poverty. The title is actually Poverty, by America, which means that America is responsible for the poverty. Why am I suddenly seeing a very different picture? You've disappeared. Are you still here? Oh, okay, you're back.
See you. We see you. Brian went and sat somewhere else.
Okay, so the title of the book implies that America is responsible for its poverty, and that each of us is responsible for tolerating it. Okay, let me just get, I'm seeing somebody's kitchen.
That's Linda's kitchen.
That's Linda. I'm going to put this, well, I don't know if it affects you.
No, it doesn't. Let me just push on. Why does the United States, the richest country on earth, have more poverty than any other advanced democracy? Why does this country tolerate a large underclass, some 30% of the population, who do not have adequate access to food, shelter, and medical care? Why does this land of plenty allow 1 in every 8 of its children to go without basic necessities, permit scores of its citizens to live and die on the streets, and authorize its corporations to pay its citizens poverty wages. So what is poverty? In a third of Americans, wow, this is going crazy.
Yeah,
We can still see and hear you fine.
Okay, that's fine. I'll just push on. I won't look at the screen. Don't worry about it. So what is poverty? A third of Americans live without much economic security, working as bus drivers, farmers, teachers, cashiers, cooks, nurses, security guards, social workers. Many are not officially counted among the poor. But what is the term for trying to raise 2 kids on $50,000 a year? What do you call it when you don't qualify for a housing voucher but can't get a mortgage either? When the rent takes half your paycheck and your student loan debt takes another quarter? When you slip below the poverty line 1 month, then rise above it the next month without ever feeling a sense of stability? As a lived reality, there is plenty of poverty well above the poverty line. And also, poverty is the feeling, the very legitimate feeling, that your government is against you, not for you, that your country was designed to serve other people. Poverty is diminished life and personhood. It shrinks the mental energy you can dedicate to decisions, forcing you to focus on the latest stressor. Something like an overdue energy bill or the loss of a job. The author says, when I first started looking into this depressing state of affairs, I figured America's efforts to reduce poverty had stalled because we had stopped trying to solve the problem. I bought into the idea, which is popular among progressives, that the election of President Ronald Reagan meant the ascendancy of market fundamentalism, or what we call neoliberalism, a time when governments cut benefits to the poor, lowered taxes, and slashed regulations. But it turns out that spending on the nation's 13 largest mean-tested programs went from $1,000 a person the year Ronald Reagan became president to $3,400 a person 1 year into Donald Trump's first election. That's a 237% increase over that span of years. So we haven't given up on taking care of the poor. And why then are they still poor? Neoliberalism is now part of the lexicon of the left. But he says, I looked in vain to find it in the plain print of federal budgets, at least as far as aid to the poor was concerned. There is no evidence that the United States has become stingier over time. The opposite is true. This makes the country's stalled progress on poverty even more baffling. Decade after decade, the poverty rate has remained flat, even as federal relief has surged. How could this possibly be? Part of the answer is that the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour was adopted 16 years ago, and the cost of living has increased by 60% during that period. Democrats push the idea that raising the minimum wage will create jobs by increasing spending, as workers will have more money in their pockets. Republicans fret that raising the minimum wage will cost jobs. You can find studies that support either position, but the truth of the evidence suggests that the employment effect of raising the minimum wage is inconsequential. Vocal segments of the American public seem to believe the poor should change their behavior to escape poverty. Get a better job, stop having children, make smarter financial decisions. In truth, It's the other way around. Economic security leads to better choices. You know, the minimum wage could be increased by a stroke of the president's pen. That's all it would take. And it's not likely that the present president is going to stroke his pen that way. Another part of the answer lies in the fact that a fair amount of government aid earmarked for the poor never reaches them. When welfare was administered through the aid to families with dependent children, that was a famous program in the country, almost all of the funds were used to provide single-parent families with cash assistance. But when President Bill Clinton, his name keeps coming up as a bad guy, when President Bill Clinton reformed welfare in 1996, he replaced this old model with something called temporary assistance for needy families.
And
in the process of doing that, he transformed the program into a block grant that gives states considerable leeway in deciding how to distribute the money. Bad idea. As a result, states have come up with rather creative ways to spend these block dollars in ways that would never have been done before. Nationwide, for every dollar budgeted for this block grants in 2020, poor families directly received just 22 cents. If we have more than doubled government spending on poverty and achieved so little, one reason is because the American welfare state is a leaky bucket. A dollar allocated to an anti-poverty program does not mean that a dollar will ultimately reach a needy family. States love to receive federal money that isn't tightly focused, and Congress could very easily fix this problem. Anytime that people don't want to take care of the poor, they say leave it to the states, because we've got a lot of Republican governors that would love to spend that money in some other way. The loss of union power in the United States is yet another reason that poverty has not declined. Between the late 40s and the late 70s, the American economy expanded and shared its bounty. You remember that? Honest work delivered a solid paycheck, and a big reason why had to do with union power. Throughout the 50s and 60s, nearly a third of all US workers carried union cards. These were the days of the United Auto Workers. Remember Walter Reuther? And the mighty American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations that together represented about 15 million workers. But union power declined catastrophically during the painful stagflation crisis of the 1970s. You remember that? When economic growth slowed, but inflation went crazy. As the manufacturing section shrank, unions lost their traditional power. Organized labor was also attacked by political adversaries. As unions flagged, business interests sensed an opportunity. Corporate lobbyists made deep inroads into both the Republican and the Democratic parties, launching a public relations campaign that blamed labor for the slump and pressured policymakers to roll back worker protections. And that's certainly been going on ever since. A national litmus test arrived in 1961. Gosh, I had forgotten this. When 13,000 air traffic controllers left their posts after contract negotiations with the Federal Aviation Administration broke down. You remember what happened? When workers refused to return to work, President Reagan fired all of them. Remember that? The public's response was muted, and corporate America learned that it could crush unions with minimum response. Quote, if the President of the United States can replace strikers, this must be socially acceptable, argued one observer at the time. And so it went in one industry after another. As global trade expanded and plants shuttered, unions collapsed, and corporate interests made sure that they remained weak. Today, only around 1 in 10 American workers belongs to a union, and most of them are firefighters, nurses, policemen, and other public sector workers. That's an incredible change. Even at this late date, Congress could restore the ability for unions to operate effectively. But instead, most states have adopted practices that make it almost impossible for unions to survive. Are you having trouble hearing me?
Oh, I'm just wondering if I should shut the camera off. Is it bothering you?
No, I'm fine.
Okay.
I've got text in front of me, so I can look at that instead of looking at you. Looking at you is fine, but it's a little strange with it flashing all the time, so I won't do that. Let me just finish the union thing. We can't chalk up today's brutal economic forces as something inexorable, like the acceleration of global trade. These things are generally the result of policy decisions. Do you remember the 1994 North American Free Trade Agreement? That was another one of Clinton's babies. NAFTA, which made it easier for companies to move their businesses to Mexico and contributed to the loss of hundreds of thousands of American jobs. These are little things. They seem little at the time. They slip past us, but they have devastating effects, particularly on people who are at the lower end of the economic ladder. The world has changed, but it has changed for other countries as well. Yet most other countries haven't experienced the kind of wage stagflation and surge in joblessness and economic inequality that the United States has. And why? A big reason is that those countries have managed to keep their unions. Okay, should I stop and let you talk, or should I?
Something from the 80s.
Yes.
U.S. Steel commissioned a study to prove that unions were destroying the steel industry.
Mm-hmm.
And the results were U.S. Steel had so many layers of administrator or supervisors that was destroying the industry, because Southern mills, it wasn't that they weren't unionized, because their wages weren't too bad for cost of living. They only had 3 levels of supervisors. So they were more efficient. It wasn't union rules.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yes. Now, in some areas it was. I mean, the feather bedding in the railroad industry was outrageous. So there were places where the unions went too far and were slapped down hard. But the unions played a very important role in providing a middle class after the Second World War.
Bill,
The GI Bill did that also, but unions certainly did. Yeah, go ahead.
do you know if many people at the time saw the effects of NAFTA?
Well, there certainly was a lot of controversy. I think that's true. But Clinton pushed it through. I think on balance, it's had a devastating effect. And that was the beginning of the large move by corporations to offshore everything that they could possibly do. I mean, most of your iPhones are not made in this country. Most of a whole lot of things are not made in this country anymore. And that was the beginning of it. That you could send everything south, have cheap labor, do their part, and bring it back into this country and pay more money every year to your stockholders. One of my favorite podiums is to think about the change that has happened in owning corporate stock. It used to be that people bought stock hoping that they would get a return on it, but that was all. Now we have the idea that those people, and it's true, those people own the company, and they've decided that what they want is a manager that will increase the value of the stock every year. And the way you do that is to treat your employees as badly as possible. That was really a new idea when it emerged, that the owners should take over in order to get larger returns than they have ever had before. And that dominates the stock market today. It causes short-term planning, which normally is bad for the company, but it has devastating effects on the employees because you pay them the minimum that you can get away with in order to maximize stockholder value. Anything else you want to talk about?
Well, it seems like just like everything else, media magnates like Rupert Murdoch, who control the narrative that's out there, have managed to paint unions in a negative light.
Sure.
They highlight the stories about at the auto workers where they had these facilities where workers who couldn't be deployed right away were being paid to just sit around and wait for jobs to open up for them. But the truth of the matter is, like, my dad was a union laborer on highway construction. He pushed a shovel all of his life. And if it hadn't been for that union, we wouldn't have had health insurance. We wouldn't have made it through the winters when he was laid off. And they were really vital for a lot of families that we were around as a kid.
Yes, they not only paid good wages, but they provided benefits like retirement benefits, health insurance benefits. All those things happened just because of unions. No corporation said, gosh, we'd like to pay our people more. In fact, unpaid work is not an indispensable, although regrettable, byproduct of capitalism, as some pro-business defenders claim today. Capitalism is inherently about workers trying to get as much as possible and owners trying to give as little as possible. With unions largely out of the picture, corporations have chipped away at the conventional mid-century work ethic, which involved steady employment, opportunities for advancement, and decent pay with some benefits. And that's just not part of the picture anymore. But let me push on. There are many ways to be exploited. When we are underpaid relative to the value of what we produce, we experience labor exploitation. And when we are overcharged relative to the value of something we purchase, we experience consumer exploitation. When someone has us over a barrel, we are at their mercy. Perhaps this is nowhere more apparent than in the retail housing market. There exists a long history of slum exploitation in America. Money made slums because slums make money. What about today? Poor Americans continue to be crippled by the high cost of housing. Rent has more than doubled over the past 2 decades, rising much faster than renters' income. Median rent rose from $483 in 2000 to $1,216 in 2021, a threefold increase. We need more housing, no one is denying that, but rents have jumped even in cities with plenty of apartments to go around. Rising rents are not simply a reflection of rising operating costs. There's another dynamic at work, one that has to do with the fact that poor people, and particularly Black families, don't have much choice when it comes to where they can live. Because of that, landlords can exploit them, and they certainly do. And this was written before what's going on now, very troubling in my mind, that more and more apartment housing in this country is being bought by people living outside this country, but making investments in housing and then exploiting them by continually raising the rents. Are you aware of this? And it isn't clear what the government could do about this one, but more and more rents are being set by investors outside the country who don't give a whit about whether they're turning people out on the street. That's
Or even hedge funds.
yes, also that.
Here.
Yes. So again, this is a form of economic exploitation, which affects not only poor people, but even middle-class people. Housing has just become an unaffordable luxury in this country. And people are spending, I think it is normally felt that you should spend a third of your income on housing. But my understanding is that has become half your housing now, half your income now. And it is, I don't know what the government could do about this one, but I don't even hear anyone discussing it. Money itself is another potential area for exploitation, and banks have rushed to increase their income from, would you believe it, overdraft fees. Deregulation of the banking system in the 1980s, this was around Clinton's time also, as I recall, heightened the competition between banks. Big banks grew bigger as community banks shuttered. And in 2019, the largest banks in America charged customers, in 1 year, $11.68 billion in overdraft fees. Not million, billion. Worse yet, customers who carried an average balance of less than $350 paid 84% of those fees. If you're poor, you have a low balance, you overdraft every once in a while. And what happened really was the poor were made to pay for their poverty. Banks could and do deny accounts to people who have a history of overextending their money, but those customers also provide a steady revenue stream for some of the most powerful financial institutions in the world. Overdrafts aimed primarily at poor people. Another way the poor pay for their poverty involves check cashing fees. You remember those? Mm-hmm. According to the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, 1 in 19 U.S. households had no bank account in 2019. Compared to white families, Black and Hispanic families were nearly 5 times more likely to lack a bank account. Where there is exclusion, there is exploitation. Unbanked Americans have created a market, and thousands of check cashing outlets now serve that market. Their formula is simple. The first step is to open stores in low-income, non-white neighborhoods. The humble and quietly proud community bank, reliable sponsor of Little League teams and Boy Scout troops, has been replaced by storefronts with bright yellow and red signs announcing checks cashed. The second part of the formula, stay open longer than traditional banks, even 24/7, and keep weekend hours, because if a check arrives on Friday, the people are so desperate for money, they cannot wait to get it until Monday. Third, cash almost everything, work checks, government checks, personal checks, without requiring a credit card or a bank account. And fourth, charge for the service. In 2020, Americans spent 1.6 billion just to cash checks to get their own money. If the poor had a costless way to access their own money, over $1 billion would have remained in their pockets during the pandemic-induced recession. Finally, payday loan services provide another exploitation of the poor. Having no credit or bad credit can prevent you from securing an apartment, purchasing insurance, and even landing a job, since employers are increasingly relying on credit checks during the hiring process. And when the inevitable happens, when you lose hours at work or when the car refuses to start, the payday loan industry steps in. For most of American history, regulators prohibited lending institutions from charging exorbitant interest on loans. But the deregulation of the banking industry in the 80s, everything goes back to the 80s. I thought the 80s were good. They were good for wealthy people, but they weren't very good for poor people. So let me pick up. The deregulation in the 1980s ushered in the money chargers back into the temple by removing strict usury limits. Interest rates soon reached 300%, then 500, then 700. Suddenly, some people were very interested in launching businesses that lent to the poor. In recent years, 17 states have brought back strong usury limits. I should have said only 17 states, but the trade thrives in most places. The APR for a 2-week, $300 loan can reach 664% in Texas, 516% in Wisconsin, and 416% in California. Congress could easily end this outrage, but it is a highly profitable for a specific group of good campaign contributors. So we have all these ways that the poor have pay huge amounts of money simply because they are poor, which certainly seems outrageous to me.
So can I say one other thing about the housing stuff that
Sure.
I'm shocked with in this book? The statistics he shows that if you are a landlord in a poor neighborhood, you probably make a greater profit than if you are in a neighborhood in a middle or upper class. Because in the middle and upper class neighborhood, you have to keep the properties up.
Yep.
And so the slum landlords actually make a lot more money than a landlord would in probably Mount Lebanon. Here we would insist that the property be kept up, but in many places that's just not policed, so or monitored. So I was really shocked about that. Their rents are somewhat lower, but not that much lower. And then there's, keeping the water running and the heat going and all of that is just not as important. So. So to me, that was a really shocking thing. It's
Well, yeah, I
really-
think what we're saying is that poor people are profitable,
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
okay? The banks profit, the money lenders profit, landlords profit. We profit from the poor, which is kind of horrifying, I think.
it's really hard.
Yeah.
So every year, over $11 billion in overdraft fees, 1.6 billion in check cashing fees, and up to 9.8 billion in payday loan fees. If you do the arithmetic, that's more than 61 million in fees collected each and every day, predominantly from low-income Americans, not even counting the annual revenue collected by pawn shops and title loan services and rent-to-own schemes. We profit from the poor.
And Bill,
Yes,
the people who profit and have power to, influence the laws that allow these things have really won with the narrative that people are poor by their own fault.
right.
Like during the Depression, so many people were poor who had been, working class or middle class. It wasn't shameful because so many people were in the same boat. But the narrative began to change that poor equals lazy,
Mm-hmm.
or irresponsible. Yeah. Well, don't have so many children.
You
Well,
remember Ronald Reagan? You remember Ronald Reagan and his welfare queens?
yeah.
That swept the country. And really, the Republican Party has never recovered from that.
Yeah.
There were welfare queens, but there are also welfare kings who are captains of industry who have gotten more from the government than the welfare queens ever got. An interesting quote: when James Baldwin remarked in 1961 how extremely expensive it is to be poor, he couldn't have imagined these incredible receipts that banks and other outfits are taking from the poor. The exclusion of poor people from traditional banking and credit systems has forced them to find alternative ways to cash checks and secure loans, which has led to a normalization of their exploitation. This is all perfectly legal, after all, and subsidized by the nation's richest commercial banks. The fringe banking sector would not exist without lines of credit extended to them by the conventional banking sector.
You know,
The whole. Go ahead. Okay.
just thinking, you were talking, family making 50,000 with 4 kids.
Mhm.
That, I mean, we personally benefit from is we pay off our credit cards every month.
Yep.
Full balance. The people who don't are subsidizing our money that we're getting on our LL Bean card and the hotel points we get on our Hilton card and the money we get back from Costco, because we don't pay 20-some% interest.
Right.
We don't pay minimum. So it's more than just the exploitation, it really goes up.
Mhm.
As you said, there are more poor people than we realize. If living precariously is poor.
Yes.
All right.
There is not just one banking sector, there are two, one for the poor and one for the rest of us, just as there are two housing markets and two labor markets. The duality of American life can make it difficult for some of us who benefit from the current arrangement, this is about us now, to remember that the poor are exploited laborers, exploited consumers, and exploited borrowers, precisely because we are not. Many features of our society are not broken, just bifurcated. For some, a home creates wealth. For others, a home drains it. For some, access to credit extends financial power. For others, it destroys it. It is quite understandable then that well-fed Americans can be perplexed by the poor, even disappointed in them, believing that they accept bad deals on impulse or because they don't know any better. But what if these deals are the only ones available to them? What good is financial literacy training for people forced to choose the best bad option? Every time I come back to this material, I am more stunned than I was before. Now, this caught me by surprise. When we have once in our history, quite recently, solved the problem of poverty, and we learned nothing from it. When the COVID-19 pandemic struck the United States, the economy went into a tailspin. Social distancing protocols caused businesses to shutter, and millions of Americans lost their jobs. Between February and April in 2020, the unemployment rate doubled and then doubled again, rivaling levels not seen since the breadlines and banker suicides of the 1930s. But the federal government responded with bold relief. It expanded the time that laid-off workers could collect unemployment, and in a rare recognition of the inadequacy of that benefit, added supplementary payments. For 4 months at the beginning of the pandemic, unemployed Americans received $600 a week on top of their regular stipend, nearly tripling the average amount of the benefit. Because of the generous unemployment benefits, alongside stimulus checks, rental assistance, expanded tax credit, and other forms of relief, poverty did not increase during the worst economic downturn in nearly a century. Instead, poverty fell, and by a tremendous amount. The US economy lost millions of jobs during the COVID-19 pandemic, but there were roughly 16 million fewer Americans in poverty in 2021 than in 2018, just 3 years before. Poverty fell for all racial and economic groups. It fell for people who lived in cities and those who lived in rural areas. It fell for the young and old. It fell the most for children. Swift government action didn't just prevent economic disaster, it helped to cut child poverty by more than half. After years of inaction, the United States had finally made a major dent in the poverty rate. You might think this victory would suggest a more thoughtful approach to poverty in the future, but nothing like that has actually happened. So we learned how to do it. You just turn on the money spigot and end poverty. And we made it through, but then we shut the spigot down. And I don't think anything like this is ever going to happen again. I don't think I realized that at the time. I don't think we made enough of it to realize what had been accomplished over a short period of time. Didn't realize it enough to make us thoughtful about how something like that could be continued into the future. You know, we were so worried about the disease and so worried about the economic collapse of the country that we didn't really realize that part of the country did very well indeed. So I've just got a few more things to say which are honest about the poor and about us. Let's be honest about the poor. Today, the biggest beneficiaries of federal aid are affluent families. To benefit from employer-sponsored health insurance, you need a good job, usually one that requires a college degree. To benefit from the mortgage interest deduction, you need to be able to afford a house. And those who can afford the biggest mortgages reap the biggest deductions. To benefit from a 529 college savings plan, you need to be able to squirrel away enough cash for your children's college costs. And the more you save, the bigger your tax break, which is why this subsidy is almost exclusively used by the well-off. The American government gives the most help to those who need it least. This is the true nature of our welfare state, and it has far-reaching implications, not only for our bank accounts and poverty levels, but also for our psychology and civic spirit. Those who benefit most from government generosity, generally white families with accountants, actually harbor the strongest anti-government sentiments. They lend their support to politicians who promise to cut government spending, knowing full well that it won't be their benefits that get the axe. Overwhelmingly, voters who claim the mortgage interest deduction are the very ones who oppose deeper investment in affordable housing. Just like those who receive employer-sponsored health insurance are the ones pushing to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Get used to it, folks. This is who we really are.
We're greedy.
We're damn greedy. Help from the government is a zero-sum affair. The biggest government subsidies are not directed at families trying to climb out of poverty, but instead go to ensure that well-off families stay well-off. This leaves fewer resources for the poor. If this is our design, our social contract, then we should at least own up to it. We should at least stand up and proclaim, yes, this is the kind of nation we want. What we cannot do is look the American poor in the face and say, we'd love to help you, but we just can't afford it, because that is a lie. Let's also be honest about the future. And in this case, I'm talking about your future. What happens to a country when fortunes diverge so sharply, when millions of poor people live alongside millions of rich ones? In a country with such vast inequality, the poor increasingly come to rely on public services, and the rich increasingly seek to divest from them. This leads to private opulence and public squalor, a self-reinforcing dynamic that transforms our communities in a way that pulls us further apart. The mid-century economist John Kenneth Galbraith popularized the predicament in his 1958 book, The Affluent Society. His great concern had to do with the fact that private fortunes were significantly outpacing investments in public services like schools, parks, and safety net programs. The process tends to begin gradually before accelerating under its own momentum. As people accumulate more money, they become less dependent on public goods and in turn, less interested in supporting them. If they get their way through tax breaks and other means, Personal fortunes grow while public goods are allowed to deteriorate. As public housing, public education, and public transportation become poorer, they become increasingly, then almost exclusively, used only by the poor themselves. In America, a clear marker of poverty is one's reliance on public services, and a clear marker of affluence is one's degree of distance from them. Enough money brings financial independence, which tellingly does not signal independence from work, but independence from the public sector. Follow the money, all of it, and you can see how a trend toward private opulence and public squalor has come to define not simply a handful of cities, but the entire nation. Over the past 50 years, personal incomes in the United States have increased by 317%, but federal revenue has increased by only 252%. Personal fortunes have outpaced the public purse, slowly choking public investments. This trend has occurred in both red and blue states alike, and the middle class, that is, all of us, will eventually suffer as much as the poor. We have an upper class, very wealthy upper class, that has created effectively their own society, their own government, as a matter of fact. We see the present administration, who's getting the money? They're going to lower the taxes on the rich. And we're caught in the middle, but we're going to go down, not up to the rich. There will be less and less money spent on public services because the rich don't need public services. I hope that shocked you as much as it shocked me.
Definitely. I just read the article in the paper about how their Pittsburgh Regional Transit is in crisis.
Right.
Yeah.
And they're going to basically eviscerate our public transportation, which of course affects the people who don't have their own transportation.
Sure.
You know, they're gonna get rid of the 41. Well, I drive up to Dormont anyway and park there, or you can park, you know, but you gotta get to Dormont.
Yeah.
And that is not an easy thing to do. If you work past 11 o'clock at night, forget it, you can't get home.
Shut it off.
So hopefully, this is the threat. Hopefully it's to make people sit up and say, hey, wait, you know, maybe this isn't such a great idea to do this. We'll see what happens.
Well, the problem is people vote against their own interests and I don't know that they necessarily understand that they're doing it. In the next 4 years, it is almost certain that they will eliminate the federal estate tax. Death taxes are going to go away, which allows people to move generational wealth completely frictionless and not share it. It's because we all think, oh, someday I'm going to have to, or my family's going to have to pay death taxes. I got news for you. Most of us, our families are never going to pay death taxes because we're not that wealthy. But we vote against our own interests.
And while people say, well, I don't want all these breaks for poor people because they haven't earned it. When you're inheriting money, you're not likely to say, I haven't done a thing to earn this money. Somebody else did. But you don't see it that, yeah, you don't see it that way. But Bill.
Yes.
In this stratified society that we're building, in spite of smart refrigerators and smart TVs and Alexa, people still want servants, you know? They still want the services that only the poor will provide them. But if they drive if the poor can't get to work to clean their houses, if the poor can't, I don't know, I mean, they still need poor people, don't they?
Well, they're going to have more and more of them. That's not a problem.
How are they gonna get to these meetings?
Well, I'm not sure. But it is, we're just breaking into two societies. A very wealthy society, which has great control over the government, and everybody else who really have very little impact on what happens in Washington.
Well, it's not just Washington. One of the things I'm thinking about is having moved from the West here, one of the things that shocked me when I moved here was our local earned income tax. So that means that the boy delivering newspapers has to pay a tax on what he's earned, while I don't pay tax on my dividends that I get from my savings account that's earning 4%. None of us here are paying earned income tax on any of that kind of stuff. So Elsie Hillman isn't paying on her income, while the person who cleans her floor is paying earned income tax. That is not right. That is, once again, the poor paying more than their share.
Well, even non-poor, Warren Buffett has famously said that his secretary pays more than he does.
Right.
A higher percentage, yes.
Yeah. Well, that is a percentage, but truly as dollar amount, the servant of Elsie Hillman is paying more than Elsie Hillman is paying, if she were still alive, on earned income.
Right. Well, what I said earlier was the ones who win are white people with accountants. The poor don't have any accountants.
Something that is rather disturbing is we're supposed to be one of the most religious countries in the world. And it is the secular countries that are taking care of all of their people. The Scandinavians.
Yes.
As much trouble as the French are having.
The social democracies, yes.
It was a Rick Steves thing. He's Norwegian. Not a bachelor farmer, but he's Norwegian. And
Back away.
he was visiting a cousin. And one of the things he said was that the city hall to the Norwegians is their sacred place, because that's where everybody takes care of them.
And get married.
Get married and the services come from. And his cousin pointed out they pay 60% of their income in taxes, but they don't pay for college. They don't pay anything for medical. And when they get old, they get taken care of. Look at what we spend for healthcare, education.
Sure.
It's more than 60% for a lot of people.
Yeah. I've run out of time, but may I take a couple of minutes and say what I think is different about them?
Sure.
The social democracies. First, they're a very uniform population. That is, they've been there since before there was a country there, whereas we were birthed in an adversarial. That is, we had white people running everything, Blacks and Native Americans suffering from it. So they're very uniform. But to me, one of the critical differences is they have a parliamentary democracy versus our presidential democracy. And the difference that, it would prevent what's going on in this country now. But more than that, think the problem with a presidential democracy is that it leads to two opposing parties who spend most of their time trying to distance themselves from each other. In a parliamentary democracy, you have multiple political parties. Think Bernie Sanders with a party of his own, because each of these countries has a liberal, if not progressive party, who manages to become part of the ruling coalition of parties and can force changes just in order to support that coalition. Here he has almost no power at all. And so that gives people the opportunity to become part of a political entity which can better represent them in the government. You know, we have no representation, those of us who are more liberal, more progressive. But in a parliamentary democracy, there will always be a party that will represent those interests and can frequently make use of that power to cause changes to take place. I think that's one of the reasons why they are social welfare democracies.
Bill, I agree with you on that, but don't forget that in the US, we also have 50 state governments, which is not something that Europeans and social democracies tend to have. They tend to have a single central government. The balance that we have right now is that we have these 50 state governments, and there are a whole spectrum of things, which is why we need to pay much more attention to our state and local politics during this time in order to maintain the stability of the republic.
Excellent.
Well, we not only have those many states, but also this is really a states' right country. That is, the Constitution gives the states any power not specifically given to the federal government. And we make very effective use of that in states. I mean, think of the abortion situation, for example. You know, in most countries, there would be a national law, but in this country, there are just states, many of which are strongly opposed. Okay, well, thank you for listening to me.
Thank you. Well done.
Oh, thank you.
Such an interesting subject.